So in this video, we are going to discuss the major battles of World War II and the events leading up to the end of the war. You will learn about the Siege of Leningrad, Japan's expanding empire, the Bataan Death March, Battle of Midway Island and the Guadalcanal, invasion of Italy, the Casablanca Conference, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, VE Day, Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Potsdam Declaration, the Manhattan Project, and VJ Day. As mentioned in the last video, Germany, having conquered most of Western Europe, now turned their sights on the Soviet Union, violating the Nazi-Soviet pact. As the Soviets retreated deeper into their country, they adopted the scorched earth policy, also covered in the last video. Fighting between the Soviets and Germans was intense. The Siege of Leningrad, the modern-day St. Petersburg, lasted almost 2.5 years and cost over 1 million lives. In September of 1941, German troops completely encircled the city. Hunger, cold, and daily bombardments made the lives of Soviets miserable until January 1944, when the Soviet Union was able to push the German army beyond Leningrad, allowing the city to celebrate the end of its siege. Meanwhile, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they also managed to seize Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. In early 1942, Japan attacked the Philippines and fights the American Filipino forces for about 4 months. Finally, running low on ammunition and food, over 11,000 American and Filipinos surrendered on May 6, 1942. They were forced to march some 60 miles to a railroad. Already weakened from weeks without enough food or medicine, at least 10,000 prisoners died during the 6 to 12-day march. The guards executed those that could not keep up. This becomes known as the Bataan Death March. The Battle of Midway Island happened on June 4, 1942. It was fought entirely from the air. The American planes found the Japanese carriers at a vulnerable time, still loading their bombs, so they were able to demolish the 4 Japanese carriers. The sinking of these carriers, plus the loss of some 250 planes, devastated the Japanese naval power. After the Battle of Midway, Japan was unable to launch any more offensive operations. The victory at Midway allowed the Allies to take the offensive in the Pacific. Their first goal was to capture Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Victory at Guadalcanal gave the Allies a base from which to counterattack the Japanese. Once the United States enters World War II, the tide begins to turn. Allies were now enjoying key victories in the Pacific, North Africa, Italy, and Russia. In July 1943, American troops attacked Sicily, which is an island just south of the Italian mainland. When the island fell in just 38 days, Mussolini was overthrown. After capturing Sicily from the Nazis and having Mussolini overthrown, the Allied forces invade mainland Italy and liberates Rome from the Nazis in June of 1944. However, it wasn't until April of 1945 that the Nazis in northern Italy finally surrendered. In January of 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met once again, but this time at Casablanca, Morocco. At the Casablanca Conference, they planned a strategy for fighting for the rest of the war. The decision was made to continue concentrating Allied resources on Europe before trying to win the war in the Pacific. Churchill and Roosevelt also agreed to accept only the unconditional surrender of Italy, Germany, and Japan. Since the main focus would now be Europe, Stalin asked the Allied forces to help shift Germany's attention and resources away from the Soviet Union by attacking Germans on the western side. The Allies would have to attack the Germans in France. A massive buildup of troops began in southern England as American, British, and Canadian forces were joined by the Polish, Dutch, Belgium, and French troops. American General Eisenhower is put in charge of Operation Overlord. In response, the Germans strengthened their defense along the French coastline. As they waited for invasion to begin, German soldiers added machine gun emplacements, barbed wire fences on beaches, land and water mines, and underwater obstruction. Anything that they could do to slow down or stop the Allies from invading France. Eventually, Operation Overlord becomes known as D-Day. Eisenhower organized the invasion of Normandy, France, involving over 3 million Allied forces. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, the largest landing by sea in history began as some 4,600 invasion craft and warships slipped out of their harbors in southern England. As the ships traveled toward France, German troops at Normandy were already being bombed, while some 23,000 airborne British and American soldiers were dropping behind enemy lines. At dawn, D-Day commenced. D-Day was the code name that was given for the day of the invasion. Allied forces invaded 5 different beaches and suffered heavy casualties, but they kept fighting. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces liberated Paris from the Nazis, which is a major victory for the Allied forces. Bitter fighting followed as the Allies broke through German defenses in France. In mid-September of 1944, Allied forces attacked the Germans occupying Holland and also began to cross the western border of Germany. The Nazis fought desperately to defend their homeland. They launched a counterattack in Belgium and Luxembourg in December of 1944. This battle came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle in Western Europe during World War II, and the largest ever fought by the U.S. Army. After this battle, most Nazi leaders recognized that the war was lost. So now the end of the war is in sight. In 1944, FDR wins the historic 4th term for his presidency. However, he dies in April of 1945, forcing Harry Truman to step up and assume the presidency. By April of 1945, American troops advanced to Berlin from the west, while the Soviet Union pushed deep into Germany from the east. In Berlin, Hitler refused to take his general's advice to flee as the Soviets closed in on the city. Instead, he fulfilled the vow that he had made back in 1939. On May 1, 1945, the German government announced that Hitler had committed suicide. A few days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. May 8th is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. While the war in Europe was officially over, the war in the Pacific was not. The U.S. had 2 goals for the Pacific Front: win back the Philippines and invade Japan. The U.S. began a policy of island hopping, like a leapfrog, in order to get closer to Japan. By February of 1945, the U.S. had regained the Philippines and captured the 2 islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest of the war. The Battle of Okinawa was equally as bloody. The American and British forces amassed at Okinawa was second in size only to the Normandy invasion in Europe. The Battle of Okinawa was one of the costliest engagements of the Pacific War. However, at long last, the way was open for an invasion of Japan. After the grueling battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American soldiers began to prepare themselves for the invasion of Japan. They knew how costly such an invasion would be. Upon taking office, President Truman learned about the secret Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a top-secret plan to create an atomic bomb suggested by Albert Einstein. Truman sent the British the Potsdam Declaration asking them to surrender, or else. However, Japan ignored America's warnings. On August 6, 1945, an American plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a city in southern Japan, and the site of a large army base. No one knows for sure how many people died, but estimates range from 70,000 to 140,000 people. Many people died from burns or radiation poisoning. Thousands of others survived, but with horrible burns. 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or totally destroyed. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. You can see here the before and after pictures of the city. The Japanese people were stunned by these developments. On August 14, the government of Japan accepted the American terms for surrender. This is known as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day. The long and destructive war had finally come to an end. So, are you able to answer the following 6 questions here based on the notes that you have written down? Can you describe what happened and the importance of the Siege of Leningrad, Battle of Midway, Battle of Guadalcanal, the invasion of Italy, D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa? What occurred during the Bataan Death March? What was decided at the Casablanca Conference? What is the importance of VE Day and VJ Day? What is the importance of the Potsdam Declaration? And finally, what is the Manhattan Project and what role did it play in World War II? Don't forget to head over to the history blog so you can answer your question. See you tomorrow.